When Clara entered the emergency room, she was soaked from the rain, but she looked calmer than any storm in the world. Everything seemed to stop for a moment. The doctors were focused on David Johnson, who lay motionless on the table, their faces filled with expressions battling hopelessness. David Johnson was the richest man in the world, but here, in this room, under the cold lights of the emergency room, his power and wealth were useless. His face was pale, and he was struggling to breathe. He was so close to death that it felt as if time was passing at a completely different speed for him. The doctors were scrambling, but they couldn't succeed. Someone said something, "There's nothing we can do." At that moment, the whole room went dark. There was a brief gap in the hopelessness. But Clara noticed something. She took slow steps. Her eyes moved to the monitors with focused clarity. She acted without thinking, her hands precise and steady, with each movement spreading her calm throughout the room. She intervened quickly. After a minute of silence, the familiar beep from the monitor signaled a sign of life. In an instant, everything in the room seemed to stop. As the doctors looked on in astonishment, Clara's calm had changed the air in the room. From that moment on, no one could see anything but Clara. Who was this woman? How had she done the impossible? At that moment, no one dared to uncover the great secret behind Clara's tranquility. Years ago, Clara was just a girl from a small town, growing up in poverty. That town was a place where no one had the chance to dream big, and no one dared to take a step further. But Clara carried a dream that would change her life. Everyone smiled at her, mocked her. "People like us can never succeed," they would say. "You'll end up just like your mother," they said, and each time, another wound was opened in Clara's heart. The helplessness she had seen in her mother's eyes as she passed away never left her mind. Her mother had suddenly collapsed one night when Clara was 10, and passed away in their one-room house. The nearest hospital was the greatest absence in that dark village. Finding a free doctor was almost impossible. Clara had helplessly watched as life slowly faded from her mother's eyes. In that moment, with each passing day, a fire burned deep in her subconscious. "One day, I won't lose anyone like this." From that day on, Clara began a solitary struggle in a world where nothing seemed to go right. She worked harder than anyone at school. Even when the streetlights were out, and the electricity was cut off, she continued to study late into the night. She flipped through old medical books she found in junk shops, memorizing every page. While the other children ran through the town's dirt roads, she worked as a volunteer at the town's only doctor's office. As she cleaned the office, she could see an unlived life through her eyes, yearning to learn. People called her obsessive, and maybe she was, but she had a mission. She was determined not to watch people fade away in front of her eyes. Over time, her efforts paid off. She earned a scholarship to one of the best medical schools. She left everything behind, her town, her small house, the hopes she had forced to hold on to, but one thing never changed: the determination and fighting spirit within her stayed with her. Clara's path seemed impossible in the eyes of the townspeople, even her family. But Clara was going to show everyone that nothing was impossible. The city was a vast stranger to Clara. As skyscrapers pierced the sky, fast cars zoomed through the streets with a roar, and luxurious lives continued without a hitch, it seemed like no one had ever faced real hardship. But Clara was different from them all. She wasn't a stranger lost in the crowd, she was a woman carrying big dreams from her small town, her tiny world. Her eyes were always focused ahead, on a bigger purpose. While her classmates spent their nights at parties, Clara spent hers solving the secrets of diseases, trying to understand the mysteries of the human body. While the others enjoyed their lives, she examined every case and solved the medical mysteries before her professors, spending long hours in laboratories studying the deepest aspects of the body and mind. Yes, she had a talent, but talent alone wasn't enough. Being called the girl from nowhere was Clara's biggest fear. Because no matter how brilliant she was, she always felt she was doomed to be one step behind in the elite world of medicine. The glittering life of the city, the carefree world of her classmates, was too different for her to be part of. But Clara would never give up. To prove herself, she worked twice as hard as the others. Every day, she passed the nights into days. Sleepless, exhausted, standing on coffee, working with a determination that nothing could stop. The elite world of medicine was ruthless. The expectations were high, and a mistake was always close. But while others were crushed under pressure, Clara became stronger and grew in that very pressure. Struggles, loneliness, and exhaustion didn't break her, on the contrary, every difficulty solidified her even more. Clara was carving her own path without needing anyone, and in the end, she would achieve far more than anyone had ever guessed. Then, one night, everything changed. It was so unexpected that it felt as if all the lights in the city had suddenly gone out. A frantic call came from the hospital. There was an emergency. A billionaire had collapsed, seemingly having a heart attack. His bodyguards were screaming in panic, calling for immediate help. In that moment, the entire hospital had descended into chaos. The best doctors in the world entered the room, but unfortunately, none of them could save the man. His pulse was weakening, growing fainter with each second. They had no time left. Clara shouldn't have been in that room. She was still a student, still too inexperienced. Approaching such a case was absolutely forbidden. However, fate had another path for her. In that moment, she was at the edge of a decision, and Clara, putting everything she knew aside, decided to intervene in this complicated situation. The voice inside her whispered that she had been waiting for this moment, that she had worked for years to be here. As Clara walked down the hospital corridor, she suddenly heard fearful voices from the room. She could hear the doctors talking helplessly, unsure of what to do. Clara's heart raced as she entered. When the door opened, the world's richest man, David Johnson, was surrounded by the country's most skilled doctors. Yet, no one could save him. In an instant, everything focused on her. Clara, in that moment, found her inner strength. No matter how young she was, no matter how little experience she had, the decision she made could change this man's life. Clara was stepping up for her first big test as a doctor, going beyond everything she had learned over the years. This was not just the life of one patient, this was also the greatest opportunity of her life. If Clara had turned around and left, no one would have said a word to her. She was so young, still a student, unauthorized. But something inside her told her to stay. There was something in impulse, a call. She took a step forward, not wasting a single second, her eyes darting to the monitors, scanning the desperate faces of the doctors. Everything stood still, like a scene from a movie. The room carried the cold air of death. "Who is that?" someone shouted, as if disturbed by Clara's presence. A nurse moved toward her, but Clara was faster. She spoke immediately, her voice calm but determined. "His pupils are unevenly dilated," she said. "Look at his hands, this isn't a heart attack. This isn't heart failure." The head doctor squinted and turned, looking at Clara. He didn't know who this woman was, but somehow what she said seemed right. "Then what is it?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. Clara took a deep breath. She relived the moment once more. She remembered a construction worker from her town who had fainted in the same way. Everyone had thought it was a heart attack, but Clara had noticed something else. It was something rarely encountered, but if misdiagnosed, it could be fatal. Clara was determined now, she wouldn't back down. "Spontaneous coronary artery dissection," she said. The room fell into silence. Clara's voice filled the four walls of the hospital room. Everyone's mouths momentarily closed, eyes shifting toward one another. A second later, a laugh was heard. "Nonsense," muttered one of the doctors, curling his lips. But then another voice rose, a younger doctor, flipping through the billionaire's files in disbelief. "But he's asleep," he said, mouth still open. "He complained of neck pain today, and he had flown this morning." Pressure changes might have triggered this. For a moment, Clara felt like she had taken a step back, but she quickly regained her composure. This was a sign confirming her. This was right. Now, it was time to act and see how things would unfold. All her years of hard work, determination, and sacrifices. This was the moment they all converged. Clara could save this man. And in doing so, she might just pave the way for her own path. Clara quickly moved into action without waiting for approval. Her mind worked tirelessly, not pausing for a moment. She grabbed the crash card, her hands delicately preparing the syringe. "We need to administer Hein now," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Otherwise, he'll have a fatal stroke in just minutes." The head doctor paused for a moment, doubt evident on his face. Administering the wrong medication could hasten the billionaire's death even further. But Clara's confidence, as young as she was and as fragile as she seemed, was solid and unwavering. She was so sure of herself that, in that moment, the entire hospital seemed to revolve around her. "Trust me," she said, taking a deep breath. There was no obedience in her words, only a sense of reality. Time was running out. There wasn't a second to argue. The billionaire's vital signs were plummeting quickly, the monitors were weakening, everything was fading. If she was wrong, it would all be over, but if she was right, she would save the world's most powerful man with one move. She had to be brave. She had to trust herself. A brief silence seemed to slow down the entire room. Clara's eyes locked with the head doctor's, hovering on that fine line between life and death. Finally, the head doctor squinted once more and made a decision. "Do it," he said, with resolve. Clara took a deep breath and swiftly administered the syringe. In that moment, the world seemed to set aside its time and live only in this instant. The room fell silent. Another moment passed. And then, the beep from the monitors revealed the difference her actions had made. Clara had made the right move. David Johnson's life was in her hands. Clara quickly injected Hein and stepped back, while everyone held their breath. In that moment, the tension in the room skyrocketed. The wild beeping from the monitors seemed to symbolize a collision on the thin line between life and death. But then, amidst the screams of those sounds, something changed: stabilization. A pulse, the man's breathing began to regulate. The room rippled like a shockwave. No one could take their eyes off the monitors. They were witnessing the turning point of David Johnson's life. Suddenly, the chaos in the room slowed down, everything seemed to stop at once. The head doctor turned to Clara. His face was unreadable. It was impossible to tell what he felt, but there was no doubt about one thing: astonishment. And just as much, surprise. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice stern, but with an underlying tone of admiration. Clara closed her eyes briefly, swallowed, then lifted her head and took a breath. There was no hesitation in her voice. "I'm just a girl who doesn't give up," she said. It was that simple, yet so profound that the meaning of her words spread through the entire room. For a moment, no one spoke. Everyone was silent, trying to make sense of what had just happened, their eyes still on David Johnson, watching his life unfold before them. They were trying to understand how everything connected. In that moment, Clara was just a student, but the confidence, determination, and skill she carried inside her felt like a lesson to all the professionals in the room. The billionaire's vital signs had stabilized, like a miracle. The room was transforming from chaos to calm. Everyone exchanged glances, realizing the quiet revolution Clara had brought into the room. Clara took a step back and for a moment, stood still, just breathing. All those struggles had finally brought her to this point. But the real question now was, everything had changed. But behind Clara's step, there had been years of struggle and determination from a woman who had fought to get here. Clara was just a student who had diagnosed what the best medical team had overlooked moments ago. In that moment, all eyes were on her, and a silence filled the room, wrapped in curiosity and astonishment. The head doctor turned to her, locking eyes with her. His gaze was sharp, almost interrogative. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice blending authority with intrigue. Clara hesitated for a moment, but the unease inside her quickly faded, replaced by calm. Despite the adrenaline surging through her veins, her voice was so steady that nothing could shake her. "Clara Weber," she said, taking a breath. Her name felt so simple and familiar, as if she had been waiting for this moment, in this room, for years. A whisper started within the room. It was as if something was being passed from one person to another, her name echoing from every corner. Some had heard of her, their eyes wide with surprise, thoughts swirling in their heads. "The sleepless scholarship student," they whispered. Those words reverberated through the room. Clara's name was known in her town, at her university, on everyone's lips. The success she had earned by working day and night for years was now a reality everyone in that room had to recognize. Despite being just a student, Clara's talent, strength, and determination brought all the experienced doctors in the room together. She was just a scholarship student, but she was also a talent that no one could ignore. Tonight, Clara Weber's name would echo throughout the hospital, and across the world. The other doctors were in awe of Clara's intelligence and solution. Everyone, still under the miraculous effect of the moment, was also surprised that a student could make such a big difference. But before anyone could process what had happened, the hospital doors suddenly opened. Two men entered, walking briskly in dark suits, their expressions as though they were hiding something, much like someone arriving for an investigation. David's security team shot Clara a sharp look, and after a brief pause, one of the men gestured toward her with a hand. "Is it you?" he asked, his voice harsh and direct. The other man continued coldly, "Come with us." Clara, confused, wanted to take a step back, but before the doctors could say anything in protest, the security officers quickly approached her, causing her to be escorted out of the emergency room. No one could say anything. After all, the situation was so sudden and mysterious that everyone could only watch as it unfolded. As Clara walked alongside the men, she had no idea what was happening. Countless questions were racing through her mind. Am I in trouble? Did I break a rule? Or is there something else going on? As she took her steps, the security officer's firm and determined demeanor whispered to her that something was wrong. But Clara was left alone with nothing but uncertainty and confusion. At that moment, no one knew where this unexpected turn of events would lead. But Clara, without fear, kept walking toward the unknown. After a while, Clara was directed through the hospital corridors to a private waiting room. When the door closed behind her, the silence inside was almost suffocating. Everything seemed trapped within the room. Thoughts and questions fluttered in Clara's mind as time seemed to stand still. Each passing minute only deepened her uncertainty. "What's going to happen now?" she thought. "Am I really in trouble?" A few minutes later, the door suddenly opened. Clara looked up and saw a woman entering with a strong presence. The woman, standing tall in a navy suit, walked with a sense of decisive authority. There was a power she carried that no one could see, yet nothing was hidden in her gaze. Clara immediately recognized who she was: David Johnson's personal assistant. The woman sat across from Clara with a serious expression on her face. Her eyes were fixed on Clara. Clara, sensing the weight of the room's atmosphere, looked at her intently. "Dr. Weber," the woman said, her voice cold and composed. "Mr. Johnson is alive because of you. This is not something to be taken lightly." The woman's words froze Clara for a moment. Time seemed to rewind a few seconds. Clara, fully aware of the heavy responsibility in her hands, fell silent. She found herself in a place she never expected to be. She realized that surviving, making the right decisions, and navigating through all the chaos wasn't easy. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The woman seemed to notice all the questions swirling in Clara's mind as she continued. "You saw something that no one else did, and at a moment when others hesitated, you acted. Such skills are rare and do not go unnoticed. Clara shifted slightly in her chair, reflecting on what was being said. In that moment, it felt as though everything had suddenly come rushing at her. There was a light in her eyes, it was a place she had reached after years of struggle and hard work. But alongside that, there were the responsibilities and unknowns that this step would bring. I just did what needed to be done, Clara said, giving a slight smile. Her answer was the simple truth that had brought her here. But seeing the expression on the woman's face made Clara realize that more was expected of her. The woman paused for a moment, studying Clara carefully, then slowly, but firmly, added, "We want you to join Mr. Johnson's personal medical team." Clara's breath caught for a moment. This was one of the biggest opportunities of her life. Joining David Johnson's medical team was the biggest chance she had ever dreamed of, the one she had chased for years. On one hand, it meant prestige, and on the other, it was the fruit of the struggles she had faced to advance in life. But such a major change also meant taking on great responsibility. Clara paused, lost in her thoughts for a moment. The years that had passed so quickly, the constant battles and efforts. What could this enormous opportunity bring her? To make everything fall into place, perhaps she had to accept this chance, but at the same time, part of her wanted to listen to her heart. One part of her said yes, but the other part. Clara took a deep breath, gathered herself one last time, and quickly said, "One moment, I need to think." In that moment, the air in the room shifted once more. Clara was about to make her decision, but she had no idea how this decision would shape her future. The woman smiled gently at Clara and softened her voice as she continued, "Of course, you don't have to make your decision right away. But keep in mind, opportunities like this don't come often." Clara remained silent for a moment, weighing the woman's words in her mind. This opportunity was the chance for someone who had been overlooked for so long to finally find her own path. For years, she had grown up in a small room in her town, dreaming of a future no one expected, and now she had taken a step no one had imagined. But this opportunity in front of her offered not only personal success but a whole new world: power, wealth, respect. It was a world where life was shaped not by dreams, but by realities. The woman noticed Clara's silence and continued, "This isn't just a job offer. It's an opportunity to place you in a significant position in this world." Clara began to think again. The turmoil inside her grew. On one side, there was the years of determination, sacrifice, and struggle that had brought her to this point. On the other side, the allure of the luxury, prestige, and power this offer promised. But then, Clara realized something. This opportunity would take her into a different world. Was this the life everyone wanted, or was it just a trap set by power and the pursuit of success? Clara took a step back, took a deep breath, and fixed her gaze on the woman, preparing herself to make her decision. David, still recovering in his room, had called for Clara to come. She quickened her steps as she entered and opened the door. David was sitting weakly but determinedly on his bed, his eyes fixed on her. As Clara stepped into the room, she met the eyes of a man who wanted to express his gratitude. "You saved my life," David said, his voice weak yet filled with deep emotion. "Now I need to thank you." Clara nodded and calmly replied, "I just did my job." David took a deep breath and smiled, this time with a different look in his eyes. "They tell me you're just a junior doctor, but what you did, others couldn't." "How did you do it?" he asked, curious about what she had done. Clara looked him directly in the eyes and spoke every word with deep confidence, "Because I never lost focus. Medicine isn't just about fame or power. It's about seeing the truth." David looked at her, a look of approval appearing on his face. "It seems like you understand that perfectly," he said. For a moment, silence filled the room before the woman continued. "Mr. Johnson, as I mentioned, we've offered Dr. Weber a place on your personal medical team," she said, looking at Clara as she clarified the situation. David nodded in acknowledgement but kept his eyes on Clara. He was curious about what she thought. "What about you? What do you think?" he asked, turning to Clara. Clara paused for a moment. Such an opportunity was rare: wealth, power, a career that would completely change her life. But she couldn't forget the moment her mother passed away. Since that day, she had wanted to work for a greater purpose, not just for money. Every step she took, she wanted to help people, to contribute to those who truly needed it. "My mission is to help people," she said, making her decision clear. "Not for the elites, but always for the people." David looked at her in surprise. "I'm grateful to hear that," he said, new respect shining in his eyes. "And that's why I want to help you." Clara felt a light spark in her eyes. David's words were more than just thanks. They were a sign of belief and understanding in her. Clara realized that while she had taken a step toward the big goals she had dreamed of for years, her true value would always lie in serving people. After Clara's words, David remained silent for a while, then continued seriously, "You kept me alive. That's why I want to help you. I have the power to finance the establishment of your own hospital, with no limitations. I can make sure you do whatever you want." Clara didn't know how to respond to this offer. After years of struggle, the opportunity she had been waiting for was right in front of her. But she could feel the weight of such a life-changing offer in his eyes. This was a chance to completely change her life, yet, on the other side, she couldn't ignore the memories of her mother's death and the helplessness of not receiving care, as well as the years she had spent growing up, seeing the needs of the people. "You're serious," Clara said, taking a deep breath in silence for a moment. "Taking such a big step. I need to think about this carefully." David smiled. "Of course, take your time. But remember, opportunities pass quickly." Clara was struggling with the decision between accepting such a large offer and taking on the immense responsibility it entailed. Inside her, there was a side that wanted to do the right thing, not just as a doctor, but as a human being. She had never wanted to be a medical advisor for the elites, like everyone thought. What she truly wanted was to help people, to make a real difference for those in need. She thought about it all night. In her eyes, there were traces of the past and the pain of losing her mother. She would never forget that moment when no doctor came to save her mother in their small town. But now, she had power in her hands. She could treat people, heal them, and truly make a difference. The next morning, she went to David's room and made her decision. "Thank you for your help," Clara said firmly. "But I'm choosing a different path. For the people, this is what I've fought for all my life. I want to establish a hospital where everyone can receive help, not just the rich, but people of all ages and from all walks of life." David was surprised by this decision, but at the same time, he respected her. "You're going to be someone who really makes a difference," he said, smiling. "And I'll support you. If you truly want to do this, I'll be with you every step of the way." Clara finally relaxed, feeling that her heart and mind were guiding her down the right path. She had made her decision and realized that David's offer came with a far greater responsibility. By carving her own path, she was taking the first step toward a new beginning. Now, she had the opportunity to fulfill her dream and truly help people. This story shows that with determination and the right decisions, you can change your life. If you'd like to hear more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. I'll be here every week with new, inspiring stories. Thank you for your support.